January 1902. Vermont. The dead of winter wrapped the mountains in silence, and within that silence, something unspeakable waited. Inside St. Mirabel's convent, 13 women were found, kneeling in rows, hands folded in prayer, eyes closed as if still in devotion. But not one could speak, not anymore. Their tongues had been removed, each one, carefully, cleanly, and placed in a copper bowl beneath a scorched crucifix. They had taken a vow of silence, but silence was not enough. Why were their mouths silenced? And what was the last sermon they heard before death? The story of St. Mirabel's convent begins not in America, but in France. 1876. In the ashes of the Paris Commune, a group of cloistered sisters fled across the Atlantic, seeking isolation, purity, and silence. They arrived in Vermont with nothing but a wooden crucifix, a locked trunk, and an unsettling doctrine. Silence was not merely a discipline, it was divine. The closer one came to muteness, the closer one came to God. In the deep woods of Windham County, they purchased a small plot of land secluded, cold, and hidden by pine. There they built their stone convent brick by brick, naming it after St. Mirabel, a little-known martyr said to have sewn her lips shut to avoid speaking sin. From the very first day, the vow of perpetual silence was more than symbolic. Cloth gags were worn during waking hours. Communication was forbidden, even in sign. When one needed to confess or report illness, they wrote on slates. No speech, no sound. Even during Mass, they chanted only in breath. Sisters who broke silence were corrected. Rumors began in the nearby town of Brattleboro that nuns who whispered in the dark were made to kneel for hours in the snow. That a sister once cried out during a nightmare and awoke with her lips stitched shut, but nothing was proven. The church praised their discipline, and over time St. Mirabel's faded from memory until one book, one whisper, and one cold February morning changed everything. In 1925, more than 2 decades after the tragedy at St. Mirabel's, the diocese authorized a partial renovation of the chapel. By then, most had forgotten the place. The younger clergy knew it only by whispered legend, the Convent of Tongues. 2 masons were sent to assess the foundation. They were not religious men. They were there for stone and rot, not souls. And yet, what they found behind the altar was not made of stone. It was hidden beneath a false panel, sealed with 3 rusted nails. Wrapped in decayed velvet was a small black ledger, about the size of a Bible, bound in human leather. Inside were 117 pages, handwritten in Latin, the ink brown, almost rust-colored. Some pages were stained with what looked like wax or dried blood. On the first page, a title, Spiritus Perforati, the Book of Breaths. Each entry listed a name, a date, and a sin. Not sins of the flesh, not theft, not blasphemy, but sounds. Sister Agnes whispered during Vespers. Sister Camille gasped during Holy Meditation. Sister Noël giggled. The punishments were written in chilling detail. Tongue pricking, 1 puncture per syllable. Iron silence mask, 2 nights. Removal of breath, 3 hours under cloth. Each page was signed with the same initials, M.A. No record exists of any Sister M.A., but her handwriting filled the book and grew more erratic as the pages went on. And then the final entry, dated January 28, 1902, no name, no sin, no punishment, just one sentence. Vox Dei tacet, vox demonis cantat. The voice of God is silent. The voice of the devil sings. Beneath the line, a crude drawing in red ink, on open mouth. Inside it, 7 tiny tongues spiraling inward like a wheel. The masons left the chapel before sundown. The Book of Breaths was turned over to the diocese and promptly disappeared. It has never been seen again. In the winter leading up to the tragedy, strange things began to stir around St. Mirabel's. The locals, most of them farmers and woodcutters, rarely saw the sisters, but they began to hear them. Not voices exactly, not hymns. What people described was something else. Low, rhythmic chanting heard through the trees at night, but the words were not Latin. Some said it sounded like a language trying to mimic leading ogled vowels and inverted syllables, spoken in a tempo that didn't quite belong to any liturgy. One man, Albie Marchand, a mail carrier, said he heard it while passing the convent's outer wall just before dusk. He described it as prayer underwater, something wet, bubbling beneath the snow. Then there was the smoke, thick black plumes seen rising from the chapel vents long after Mass should have ended. It wasn't wood smoke, they said. It had a chemical stench, bitter and metallic, like burning oil and old blood. A group of children playing in the woods claimed they saw shadows moving across the upper windows of the convent. Not walking, but twitching. One child insisted he saw a figure suspended in the air, arms out, head twisted backward. By early January, even the parish priest, Father Michaud, stopped visiting. He would later write, in a letter never meant for public reading, "I felt heresy growing there, but it was not doctrinal. It was in the air, in their silence." The final delivery to St. Mirabel's came on January 29th, 1902. A basket of bread, milk, and salted pork was left at the gate standard for isolated convents during heavy snow. It was never retrieved. When the delivery boy returned days later, he found the basket frozen solid, untouched. The chapel bell had not rung in over a week, and the snow on the path remained unbroken. From that day forward, no sound was heard from within the convent walls. It was February 20, 1902. Bishop Ramil Thorne arrived unannounced at St. Mirabel's. He had received no letters, no requests for confession or communion from the convent in over 4 weeks. The church had grown uneasy. He rode in alone, through deep snow, reaching the stone gates by mid-morning. He expected a locked door. What he found was worse. The chapel doors stood slightly open, just enough for cold to escape, just enough for something darker to seep out with it. The bishop stepped inside, lantern in hand. The air was freezing. Still, not even the wind dared move within those walls. The pews were empty. But before the altar, 13 figures knelt in rows. Their black habits were dusted with frost, their hands folded neatly at their chests, heads bowed, as if in eternal prayer. He called out to them. No response. He approached the first row. Sister Amélie, eyes closed, skin pale blue, and something missing. Her mouth gently parted, hollow. He examined the others, one by one, every nun, every face, silent, still, and mutilated. Each tongue had been removed with surgical precision. They were not ripped out, they were cut, cleanly, each wound cauterized as if sealed by fire. And beneath the altar, a copper basin, inside, floating in darkened brine, 13 tongues. Above it, the crucifix. It had been turned upside down, the wood charred black as if scorched from within. The bishop collapsed shortly after. He was found hours later by a passing hunter, muttering in Latin, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. He would die 3 weeks later in a sanitarium. His final written words, scrawled into the wall of his cell, they sang with no mouths, and something sang back. The church declared it a collective suicide, though no blades were found. No signs of poison, no trauma beyond the tongues. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia and mass psychosis. But the medical examiner, Dr. Kessler, resigned the next day. He never explained why. The official investigation lasted less than 2 weeks. Representatives from the diocese arrived quietly. No press, no photographs, no funerals. The 13 bodies were buried in a shared grave behind the convent, marked only by a single stone. Sorores Silentes, the Silent Sisters. No autopsies were conducted, no clergy interviewed. The Book of Breaths, recovered weeks earlier, was never mentioned in the reports. Bishop Thorne's journal disappeared. The church's final statement was clinical, distant. Due to extreme ascetic practices, prolonged isolation, and spiritual fervor, the Sisters of St. Mirabel succumbed to an episode of collective delusion resulting in self-harm. But those who were there, those who saw the Seneniver, spoke of it again. The convent itself was sealed, windows bricked, doors bolted. A large wooden cross nailed across the chapel entrance, upside down. Ownership of the land returned to the diocese, but no new orders were assigned. The building was left to rot in silence. 3 months later, the lead investigator, Father Lewin, died in a fire. His home consumed in minutes. Witnesses claimed the blaze began in his study where he kept the Mirabel file. When archivists searched for church records from 1902, they found only gaps. Baptismal logs, correspondence, death records all gone, not missing, removed. To this day, the Vermont Diocesan Archive contains only one document related to the convent. A single transfer deed dated 1876, signed in trembling script by someone named Mirabel Anthelm. But no such name appears in any list of saints, nuns, or French immigrants of the time. It is the only written trace of her existence. Over a century has passed, but what happened at St. Mirabel's remains unsolved, and perhaps more disturbingly untouched. 13 women died in prayerful posture, not bound, not browsed, not broken, as if they had consented. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned pews, no broken doors. The scene was almost reverent, and yet the details defy all natural explanation. Why were their tongues removed with surgical precision, without a trace of blood on their garments or the stone floor beneath them? Who cauterized the wounds, sealing them neatly? No fire had been lit, no medical tools found. How could 13 women devoted to faith commit such an act in perfect unison and in silence? Some speculated it was a ritual, but no Catholic rite, no heretical sect, no occult handbook describes a sacrament of tongues. And then there was the basin beneath the altar, the copper bowl, still warm to the touch in the dead of winter, filled with preserved tongues, their pinkness unnerving, as if they were fresh. The copper was tested. It contained traces of iron and an unknown compound, never identified by modern chemists. And yet the bowl itself vanished shortly after, along with the Book of Breaths and all associated relics. The final anomaly came weeks later, during a discreet second inspection by a junior priest named Elias Greer. Behind the altar, beneath loose plaster, Greer found a carving deep and deliberate. Not a cross, not a saint. It was a mouth, wide open, stylized like a medieval illumination, and inside that gaping maw, 7 tongues, twisting inward like petals of a flower. He reported the carving to his superior. By morning, it had been removed, chiseled out, replaced with plaster. The priest who reported it was reassigned to a remote mission in Patagonia. He died less than a year later of unknown illness. Today, the church maintains the event was tragic, but unremarkable. The convent, they say, is an architectural relic, not a sacred site. But ask the locals of Windham County, and they will tell you otherwise. The ruins of St. Mirabel's still stand, shrouded by pine, hidden behind rusted gates and warning signs that read, "Private land, no trespassing." No official address is listed. It appears on no map, and yet some still find it, some still go there. In 2006, a group of paranormal investigators trespassed onto the grounds. They entered the chapel with night vision cameras, EMF detectors, and a digital recorder. They were only inside for 15 minutes. The footage was mostly unusable static, interference, inexplicable glitches. But the audio survived. What they captured was not silence. It began as faint whispers, then rose to a low chant, and then something else, a second voice, guttural, layered beneath the chant but not human, not growling, not screaming, singing, not in Latin, not in any language known to the Vatican's linguists, but one word repeated clearly could be distinguished. Tacere, Latin for be silent. The investigators left Vermont the next day. 2 of them deleted the recordings. 1 joined a monastery. The lead investigator refused to speak for years until his death, from self-inflicted wounds. His final journal entry read, "There is no silence in that place, only something waiting to be heard." Today the ruins are overgrown. The bell tower collapsed in 1983. The chapel's roof fell inward in a storm. Moss covers the stones, and the windows are shattered. But locals say the structure breathes, that the wind does not pass through it, it bends around it. One hiker claimed to have seen candles lit inside. Another said they heard nuns singing without voices, just breath, like wind through a flute. Those who speak near the convent often report sore throats. Some lose their voices for days. A few nevarikawa whispers continue to this day of a secret order, a ritual designed not to worship God but to keep something buried. An old woman in Brattleboro, the granddaughter of the convent's last supplier, once said this: "They weren't punished for speaking, they were silenced before they could reveal what was speaking through them. What that was remains unknown." The church never re-sanctified the land. No mass has been held there since 1902. No exorcism, no consecration, no attempt to cleanse what still lingers in those stones. And maybe that's the most chilling detail of all. For in the absence of faith, of light, of even sound, something else finds room to grow. And when you kneel in silence, in perfect submission, in utter stillness, you may not be alone, because silence in that place is never empty.